ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ शांति शांति शांति। Namaskar my dear friends. This is sixth video on Bhagwan Sri Ramana Maharshi's teachings in his own words. So I start the video number 6 with the question by a visitor: whence comes birth? Bhagwan replies, whose birth? Visitor: the Upanishads say, he who knows Brahma becomes Brahma. Bhagwan: it is not a matter of becoming but of being. There is no such thing as realizing the self. Bhagwan has often said this in order to remind those who ask that the self alone is now and eternally and is not something new to be discovered. This paradox is of the essence of non-dualism. In answer to a question as to what is the best way to the goal, Bhagwan said, there is no goal to be reached. There is nothing to be attained. You are the self. You exist always. Nothing more can be predicated of the self than that it exists. Seeing God or the self is only being the self. That is yourself. Seeing is being. You, being the self, want to know how to attain the self. It is like a man being at Ramanashramam and asking how many ways there are of going to Ramanashramam and which is the best way for him. All that is required of you is to give up the thought that you are this body and give up all thoughts of external things or the non-self. As often as the mind goes out towards objects, stop it and fix it in the self or I. That's all the effort required on your part. Despite this paradox, however, Bhagwan also stressed the necessity of effort as explained in chapter 2 of this book. Ceaseless practice is essential until one attains without the least effort that natural and primal state of mind which is free from thought. In other words, until the I, my, and mine are completely eradicated and destroyed. It is in order to safeguard the viewpoint that there is nothing new to be discovered that Advaita explains that it is only a question of removing the screen of ignorance. Just as by removing water plants, one reveals beneath them the water that was already there, or as the removal of clouds reveals the blue sky that is there already but was hidden by them. Devotee puts a question: how can one know the self? Bhagwan Ramana replies, the self always is. There is no knowing it. It is not some new knowledge to be acquired. What is new and not here and now cannot be permanent. The self always is, but knowledge of it is obstructed, and the obstruction is called ignorance. Remove the ignorance and knowledge shines forth. In fact, it is not the self that has this ignorance or even knowledge. These are only accretions to be cleared away. That's why the self is said to be beyond knowledge and ignorance. It remains as it naturally is. That's all. This concentration on the self, of course, requires intense control of the mind, and many complained that it was not easy. In the evening, a visitor asked Bhagwan how to control the wandering mind. He began by saying that it was a question which particularly troubled him. Bhagwan replied laughing, "That's nothing particular to you. That's what everybody asks and what is dealt with by all the scriptures such as the Gita. What other way is there except to draw the mind back every time it strays or turns outwards as advised in the Gita? Of course, it is not an easy thing to do. It will come only with practice." The visitor said that the mind strays after what it desires and won't stay fixed on the object we set before it. When there was this sort of complaint, Bhagwan sometimes answered that self-acquired self-enquiry does not set any object before the mind, but simply turns it in on itself, seeking its source. On this occasion, however, he answered from the point of view of desire or happiness. Everybody seeks only what brings him happiness. Your mind wanders after some objects or other because you think that happiness comes from it, but find out where all happiness comes from, including that which you regard as coming from sense objects. You will find that it all comes from the self alone, and then you will be able to abide in the self. Some people complained of the difficulty of quelling thoughts. Bhagwan brought them round again to self-enquiry by reminding them that it is the thinker, or in case of doubt, the doubter, whom one must examine. There may be 1,000 doubts, but one does not doubt the existence of the doubter, who is he. All doubts will cease only when the doubter and his source have been found. It is no use endlessly removing doubts. If we clear up one, another will arise and there will be no end to them. But if the doubter himself is found to be really non-existent by seeking his source, then all doubts will be ceased. Mind control, of course, means concentration. But by concentration, Bhagwan did not mean concentrating on one thought, although he did not always discourage this, but concentrating on the sense of being, the feeling of I am, and excluding all thoughts. Bhagwan answers, concentration is not thinking of one thing. On the contrary, it is excluding all thoughts, since all thoughts obstruct the sense of one's true being. All efforts are to be directed simply to removing the veil of ignorance. In a number of passages already quoted, Bhagwan does not only tell the questioner to investigate the I thought, but to find out where it arises. This connects self-inquiry with concentration on the heart at the right side referred to in chapter 1 and shows still more clearly that it is not a mental process. Indeed, an actual liberation that can be felt physically arises in this center during self-inquiry. Concentrating the mind solely on the self will lead to happiness or bliss. Drawing in the thoughts, restraining them and preventing them from straying outwards is called detachment, vairagya. Fixing them in the self is spiritual practice, sadhana. Concentrating on the heart is the same as concentrating on the self. Heart is another name for self. G.V. Subramanya. Is it stated in any book that for ultimate and final realization one must ultimately come to the heart even after reaching the Sahasrara, the thousand-petal lotus, the center in the crown of the head, and that the heart is at the right side? Bhagwan replies, no, I have not come across this in any book, although in a Malayalam book on medicine I came across a stanza locating the heart on the right side, and I have translated it into Tamil in the supplement to the 40 verses. We know nothing about the other centers. We cannot be sure what we arrive at by concentrating on them and realizing them. But as the I arises from the heart, it must sink back and merge there for self-realization. Anyway, that has been my experience. Know that the pure and changeless self-awareness in the heart is the knowledge which, through destruction of the ego, destroys liberation. The body is inert like an earthen pot, since it has no I consciousness, and since in deep sleep, when body left, we experience our natural being, the body cannot be the I. Who then is it that causes I-ness? Where is he? In the heart cave of those who thus enquire and who know and abide as the self, Lord Arunachala Shiva shines forth as himself as that an I consciousness. Devotee, Bhagwan was saying that the heart is the center of the self. Bhagwan says, yes, it is the one supreme center of the self. You need have no doubts about that. The real self is there in the heart behind the ego self. Devotee, will Bhagwan please tell me where in the body it is? Bhagwan, you cannot know it with your mind or picture it with your imagination. Although I tell you that it is here, pointing to the right side of the chest. The only direct way to realize it is to stop imagining and try to be yourself. Then you automatically feel that the center is there. It is the center spoken of in the scriptures as the heart cavity. Devotee, can I be sure that the ancients mean this center by the term heart. Bhagwan. Yes, you can, but you should try to have the experience rather than locate it. A man does not have to go and find where his eyes are in order to see. The heart is there, always open to you. If you care to enter it, always supporting your movements, although you may be unaware of it. It is perhaps more correct to say that the self is the heart, really the self is the center and is everywhere aware of itself as the heart or self awareness. Devotee, when Bhagwan says that the heart is the supreme center of the spirit or the self, does that imply that it is not one of the six yogic centers, chakras? Bhagwan, the yogic centers, counting from the bottom upwards, are a series of centers in the nervous system. They represent various stages, each having its own kind of power or knowledge, leading to the Sahasrara, the thousand petals lotus in the brain, where is seated the supreme Shakti power. But the self that supports the whole movement of the Shakti is not located there but supports it from the heart center. Devotee. Then it is different from the manifestation of Shakti. Bhagwan. Really, there is no manifestation of Shakti apart from the Self. The Self became all these Shaktis. When the yogi attains the highest state of spiritual awareness, samadhi, it is the Self in the heart that supports him in that state, whether he is aware of it or not. But if his awareness is centered in the heart, he realizes that whatever centers or states he may be in, he is always the same truth, the same heart, the one self, the spirit that is present throughout, eternal and immutable. The Tantra Shastra calls the heart Surya Mandala or the solar orb, and the Sahasrara as Chandra Mandala or lunar orb. This shows the relative importance of the two. Just as this concentration on the heart establishes a point of contact with yoga, so also Bhagwan sometimes pointed out the affinity with bhakti, the path of devotion, and said that the two paths leads to the same end. Perfect devotion means complete surrender of the ego to God or Guru, conceived of as other than oneself, while inquiry leads to dissolution of the ego. More will be said about Bhakti Marga in the next chapter, but the following explanation shows how the two paths converge. Devotee, if the I is an illusion, who is it that cast off the illusion? Bhagwan replies, the I cast off the illusion of the I and remains I. Such is the paradox of the self-realization. The realized do not see any paradox in it. Consider the case of the worshipper. He approaches God and prays to be absorbed in Him. He then surrenders himself in faith and by concentration. And what remains afterwards in the place of the original I? Self surrender leaves a residuum of God in which the I is lost. That is the highest form of devotion or surrender and the peak of detachment. You may give up this and that of my possessions, but if instead you give up I and mine, all is given up at a stroke, and the very seed of possession is destroyed. Thus, the evil is nipped in the bud or crushed in the germ. But detachment must be very strong to do this. The craving to do it must equal the craving of a man who is held under water to rise to the surface and breathes. If distracting thoughts are a danger on one hand, so also is a sleep a danger on the other hand. In fact, people who are beginning a spiritual path may find themselves assailed by an overpowering wave of sleepiness whenever they begin to meditate. And then, if they stop meditating, this passes and they are not sleepy at all. This is simply one form of the ego's resistance and it has to be broken down. Mr. Bhagwan also said something about sleep, and this led Bhagwan to speak about sleep as follows. What is required is to remain fixed in the self always. The obstacles to that distraction by things of the world, including sense objects, desires, and tendencies on the one hand, and sleep on the other. Sleep is always mentioned in the books as the first obstacle to samadhi, and various methods are prescribed for overcoming it according to the stage of evolution of the person concerned. First one is enjoined to give up all worldly distractions and to restrict sleep. But then it is said, for instance, in Gita, that one need not give up sleep entirely. One should not sleep at all during daytime, and even during night restrict sleep to the middle portion from about 10 to 2. But another method that is prescribed is not to bother about sleep at all. Whenever it overtakes you, you can do nothing about it, so simply remain fixed in the self or in meditation every moment of your waking life and take up, take up meditation again the moment you wake, and that will be enough. Then, even during sleep, the same current of thought or meditation will be working. This is evident because if a man goes to sleep with any strong thought working in his mind, he finds the same thought present when he wakes up. It is of the man who does this with meditation that it is said that even his sleep is samadhi. It is important to remember this because the Maharshi often spoke of sleep as an example of the egoless state. As the above passage shows, he did not mean that physical sleep is to be encouraged. That's only a dark, unconscious counterpart of the true egoless state, which is pure consciousness. Another source of questions among those who continued further with meditation was that they sometimes came up against a blank or void or feeling of fear, but they were told to carry on holding firmly to that which experiences the void or fear. The same answer was also given to those who experienced a state of bliss. There can be neither fear nor pleasure, neither vision nor void. without someone to experience it. Devotee puts a question. When I reach the thoughtless stage in my sadhana, I enjoy a certain pleasure, but sometimes I also experience a vague fear which I cannot properly describe. Bhagwan replies, whatever you experience, you should never rest content with it. Whether you feel pleasure or fear, ask yourself who feels it and continue your effort until both pleasure and fear are transcended and all duality ceases and the reality alone remains. There is nothing wrong in such things being experienced, but you must never stop at that. For instance, you must never rest content with the pleasure of laya dissolution experienced when thought is quelled, but must press on until all the duality ceases. In the afternoon, the following questions were put by Mr. Bhargava, an elderly visitor from Jhansi in Uttar Pradesh. First, how am I to search for the I from start to finish? Second, when I meditate, I reach a stage where there is a vacuum or void. How should I proceed from there? Bhagwan replies, never mind whether there are visions or sounds or anything else, or whether there is void. Are you present during all these or are you not? You must have been there during the void to be able to say that you experienced a void. To be fixed in that you is the quest from start to finish. In all books on Vedanta, you will find this question of a void or nothing being left raised by the disciple and answered by the Guru. It is the mind that sees objects and has experiences, and that finds a void when it ceases to see and experience. But that is not you. You are the constant illumination that light up both the experience and the void. It is like the theater light that enables you to see the theater, the actors, and the play while the play is going on, but also remains a light and enables you to say that there is no play on when it is all finished. Or there is another illustration. We see objects all around us, but in complete darkness we do not see them and we say, I see nothing. In the same way, you are there even in the void you mention. You are the witness of the three bodies, the gross, the subtle, and the causal, and of the three times past, present, and future, and also this void. In the story of the tenth man, when each of them counted and thought they were only nine, each one forgetting to count himself. There is a stage when they think one is missing and do not know who it is, and that corresponds to the void. We are so accustomed to the notion that all that we see around us is permanent and that we are this body, that when all this ceases to exist, we imagine and fear that we also have ceased to exist. Bhagwan also quoted verses 212 and 213 from Viveka Chudamani, in which the disciple says, after I eliminate the five seats as not self, I find that nothing at all remains. And the Guru replies that the self or that by which all modifications, including the ego and all its creatures and their absence, that is the void or perceived is always there. Bhagwan continued and said, the nature of the self or I must be illumination. You perceive all modifications and their absence. How? To say that you get the illumination from another would raise the question how he got it, and there would be no end to the chain of reasoning. So you yourself are the illumination. The usual illustration of this is the following. You make all kinds of sweets of various ingredients and in various shapes, and they all taste sweet because there is sugar in all of them, and sweetness is the nature of sugar. And in the same way, all experiences and absence of them contain the illumination which is the nature of the self. Without the self, they cannot be experienced, just as without sugar, no one of the articles you make can taste sweet. Later he continued, first one sees the self as objects, then one sees the self as void, then one sees the self as the self. Only in this last case there is no seeing because seeing is being. Before closing this chapter, it may be well to give a few more specific rules, or rather to indicate that they exist but are not essential. It is usual to conduct what is called meditation during regular hours, morning and evening, sitting with a straight spine and closed eyes. I say what is called meditation because this word is commonly used for self enquiry and concentration on the IN or the heart as described in this chapter. It is, of course, far from the mental reflection that commonly goes by that name. In India, it is usual to sit cross legged on the ground. However, all such rules of technique are less important in the self inquiry than with other less direct methods. Indeed, this is obvious from the fact that self-inquiry has gradually to be extended from set hours of meditation until it becomes the undercurrent of all thoughts and actions. Mr. Evans Vance asked a few questions. They related to yoga. He wanted to know if it was right to kill animals such as tigers, deer, and so on, and use the skin as a seat for the yoga posture asana. Bhagwan, the mind is the tiger or the deer. Devotee, if everything is illusion, can one then take life? Bhagwan, who has the illusion? That is what you must find out. In fact, everyone is a killer of the self. Atmahan at every moment of his life. Devotee, which posture is the best? Bhagwan, any posture, possibly Sukhasana, the easy or half of Buddha just posture. But that is immaterial for jnana, the path of knowledge. Devotee, does posture indicate temperament? Bhagwan, yes. Devotee, what are the properties and effects of a tiger's skin or wool or a deer's skin as a seat? Bhagwan, some people have found out and described them in books on yoga. They correspond to conductors and non-conductors of magnetism and so on. But all this is of no importance on the path of knowledge, Jnana Marga. Posture really means steadfastness in the self and it is inward. Devotee, which is the most suitable time for meditation? Bhagwan, what is time? Devotee, tell me what it is. Bhagwan, time is only an idea. There is only reality. Whatever you think it is, it appears to be. If you call it time, it is time. If you call it existence, it is existence, and so on. After calling it time, you divide it into the days and nights, months, years, hours, minutes, and so on. Time is immaterial for the path of knowledge, but some of these rules and disciplines are good for beginners, devotee. Does Bhagwan recommend any special posture for Europeans? Bhagwan, it depends on the mental equipment of the individual. There are no hard and fast rules. Devotee. Is meditation to be practiced with eyes open or closed? Bhagwan. It may be done either way. The important thing is that the mind should be turned inward and kept active in its quest. Sometimes it happens that when the eyes are closed, latent thoughts rush forth with great vigor. But on the other hand, it may be difficult to turn the mind inwards with the eyes open. It requires strength of mind. The mind is pure by nature but contaminated by taking in objects. The great thing is to keep it active in its quest without taking in external impressions or thinking of